Hi, my name's Elliot Neaman. I'm currently the president of the University of San Francisco Faculty Association, and I teach in the history department here. I came to USF and began teaching in 1993, and I'm here today with Alan Heineman, who is the former president of the Faculty Association, who currently teaches in the English department and came to USF in 1970. And Alan, we want to talk today about the history of the association, which is a union. I want to start by asking you about the time before the union was formed in 1975, what it was like to be here.
Well, I didn't have much basis for comparison because I'd come right out of graduate school, so I didn't know what universities and university faculties were supposed to be like. I did know right away that we were kind of on the lower end of the pay scale because I did have a couple of other job offers, but it was all pretty comparable. They were, in those days, the standard salary offer starting out for an assistant professor was $9,000 or $10,000 or $11,000 a year.
Which would be in today's dollars around?
You're the economist.
Right. But a lot less than...
Way less than we have now. But it was competitive. It was kind of low-end competitive. And I'm jumping forward now. I'm going to back up in a second. In 1975, when the union was formed, one of the stimuli for forming the union was that the pay scale had gone up almost not at all. We'd had in 5 years, I believe it was, there were only 2 years in which the pay increase matched inflation, and 3 years when it was either a less than cost of living increase or no increase at all. So that by 1975, I was making $11,000 a year. So that was one problem. But generally you get unions when there's a combination of economic and rights issues. And the faculty felt disrespected. There were a number of incidents that involved not consulting the faculty or not listening to them when they were consulted. Two of them that I remember were once in the University Senate, which consisted of administrators and faculty and students. The issue of ROTC came up because we were still in the Vietnam War, and many of the faculty didn't want to have an ROTC chapter on campus. And the academic vice president, who chaired the University Senate, just gavelled the speaker down and said, "We're not going to discuss that in this body," and walked out. So it was clear that you could only discuss certain things that were approved. And there were a couple of issues like that. And so there was a fair amount of discontent. Some of the old-timers were okay with all of this, but some of the younger people that had different expectations were agitated by it. It was kind of a backwater, even though we were in San Francisco, one of the most advanced and progressive cities in the U.S. USF was kind of not noticing that the 20th century was well underway, and so it was a difficult set of transitions.
So where did the idea of maybe forming a union come from?
Well, this is the creation myth, except it happens to be true. There was, in the University Senate, there was a committee called the Faculty Welfare Committee. We like to say because many of us had to go on welfare, but that wasn't quite right. But they, every year, went hat in hand to the president and said, "How much can you give us next year?" And the president would name a figure, and they would say, "Thank you very much," and shuffle out. And they went to see the president after there had been so many years of not meeting cost of living, and so our salaries had fallen well behind. And said, "Well, we really need about 8 or 10% for next year." And the president said, Father McGinnis at that time, said, "Well, you're getting 2.5%. And they were shocked by that. And he said, "But inflation has gone up over these 5 years, so and so and so and so. So we really need to catch up with inflation. We've fallen behind. You're getting 2.5%, he said. And ushered them out, and they sort of just couldn't think of what to do next. And then they interviewed or met with some of the members of other working groups on campus, most of which were unionized. And they said, well, what are you getting next year? To the janitors, to the stationary engineers, to the gardeners, to the secretaries, and office assistants. Oh, we're getting 6%, we're getting 8%, we're getting 10%. So they asked for another appointment with the president and went back and said, all your other working groups are getting 6 and 8 and 10%. We don't want to be treated special, but we'd like to be treated as well as, we're only the faculty after all, we'd like to be treated as well as the other working groups on the faculty, in the university. So we'll be happy to take a weighted average of whatever increase everybody else is getting. And he said, you're getting 2.5%. And they stared disbelieving and said, but how can you justify that? How can you give everybody else what you're giving them and give your faculty 2.5%? And he said, because they're unionized. I have to bargain with them. I don't have to bargain with you. If you don't like it, go to collective bargaining, and ushered them out again. And these 5 or 6 loyalist faculty, not a radical amongst them, I don't think, hardly a liberal amongst them, much less a trade unionist. And they stood out in the hallway and said, well, what would this collective bargaining be, and where would you go to do it, and so forth. But they were, of course, offended and hurt and angry. And they got advice. They got advice from a couple of USF faculty who taught labor back in the days when labor was taught in business schools. It isn't taught anymore very much. But they got advice from Father Boss, who ran the labor management school in the business school. And they got advice from other friendly faculty who put them in touch with the NLRB and put them in touch with a union attorney. And so it started, and there was a struggle to get people to sign on to advocate for a union. They set a vote. The vote was about a 2-to-1 majority for unionizing. And all of this took 5 or 6 months.
I think most people know, what the NLRB is, but just to make sure, explain and what its role is in something like that.
The National Labor Relations Board. Labor is governed in the public sector by state labor laws, so that if we were a public university in California, we'd be governed by California labor laws. In the private sector, they're governed by the National Labor Relations Act, which set forth, it's almost a century ago, the boundaries and the rules for labor and for management under federal law. And that act is administered by a board, the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB. And so if a group of employees wishes to unionize, to form a unit for collective bargaining, they have to go to the NLRB to be certified for collective bargaining.
Now, you mentioned that there was this group who were part of the welfare committee. Eventually, some of those would be the leaders of the union. Tell us a little bit about some of those people and their roles.
Well, and I wish I could remember everybody, and I'm sure I'm going to leave somebody important out. But the man who became the first president of the union was Mike Lehman.
He was one of the 6, the original.
Yes. To the best of my knowledge and recollection, again, some of this is fuzzy. I wasn't there. Right. I wasn't in this group at this time. But it was Mike, it was Ted Mink, who was a classicist and a former Jesuit, I don't know what you call him. He started out, in the novitiate, I think, but he dropped out. Jesse Machuchik, who was in his 60s and was this very elegant, very conservative classicist, Greek and Roman classics. Joe Cimini, who was a faculty member in the business school. And I know I'm leaving out 1 or 2 others, but that was the group, and they became the central leadership of the union, with some people not participating and other people being added on. But that was the core of the foundation of the union.
Now tell us a little bit about the people who helped from outside of USF. I know there's this very colorful figure as a labor lawyer. Tell us a little bit about him.
We got put in touch with Victor Van Borg. We were told correctly that he was the most prominent labor attorney in Northern California. And his firm handled collective bargaining and labor groups from city workers and steel workers, and they represented a lot of workers in California. We are not told that he was an unreconstructed Stalinist. That we discovered later. But I think we disappointed him. I think we were much too much of the professoriate and eventually not enough of the working class. But anyway, he was a brilliant attorney, and he helped us, and he explained things to us, some things that we had never thought about before, we'd never had any occasion to think about before. And he bargained, he was the lead bargainer for our first several contracts. And he was about 6 foot tall, I would say. He weighed, it varied widely, but he weighed anything from maybe 280 to 420. He ballooned back and forth. A very complex man, a very literate man, but also a no-nonsense, unions are right, managements are always wrong, and so forth.
Tell us a little bit about how the faculty reacted. I can't imagine that everybody was on board for this. There must have been some dissension.
Oh, there was a lot of dissent, and it's the usual kind of dissent. We're not laborers, we're professionals. And what somebody said to me very early on, and as an English teacher this is especially true in my case, and as a historian I think also in yours, you think you're a professional? Go hang out a shingle, see how well you do. So it became clear to many of us pretty quickly that we were salaried employees, that the university was our employer, and that we were at the service of an employer who paid our wages. That has never bothered me, but it bothers a lot of faculty who like to think of themselves as elite.
So was there an active opposition then? Did people try to sabotage them?
Oh yes, in all kinds of ways. And when Mike became first the chair of the steering committee before we even had a union and had a union structure, he was subjected to the most awful vilification, and you could understand it coming from the administration. It was hard to understand it coming from fellow faculty. But there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism on campus in those days, and Mike as a Jew got the brunt of that, and I as a Jew got some of it. There were people who just felt we were selling out the faculty, that the faculty really ran the university, even though recent history should have demonstrated very clearly that faculty did not run the university, but they couldn't quite assimilate those facts. They were still living in sort of a vision of ideal academe, and we weren't there. And some people recognized that quickly, some people recognized it slowly, and some people never recognized it. So Mike was screamed at and hollered at, and there was papers got lost, turned up missing. People leaned out windows when we were having public meetings and screamed at it, trying to disrupt it. And as I say, sometimes these were administrators, but sometimes they were other faculty.
So tell us a little bit about the administration. Did they try to stop the vote from taking place? Did they try to spread, anti-union propaganda? Or whatever
they did.
It
wasn't very effective. We were sometimes hurt and sometimes helped by the general inefficiency of the administration. For example, had they been more efficient, we wouldn't have been in the economic bind that we were in, because by 1975 the university was in some trouble economically. They were also not very effective in disrupting organizing. They would hold little meetings with the faculty who they thought to be on their side and would feed them lines and feed them tactics. And of course, some of the faculty whom they thought to be on their side were in fact on our side and would report what had gone on. So we were ready for most of what had happened, but it was still shocking to me that it became so deeply personalized, and that the university is and is supposed to be a place where you debate ideas, and that's good. There was no problem with people saying, here's all the reasons why faculty shouldn't unionize and so on. That never bothered me. I disagreed, but that's fine. They disagreed with us. What was hurtful was the vituperation, was the personal animus, and I don't know everything that was behind it, but it was very unsettling. But it turns out, to jump ahead, when we took the unionization vote, it was 3 or 4 to 1 for unionizing. It was an overwhelming majority. So those who caused disruption and trouble on the faculty were not silenced. They were never silenced, but they were pushed back by the great majority of the faculty who saw what was happening.
So now the vote has been taken. We're in 1975. Is this the point at which you get involved? And what else happens in that year before we get to the first contract?
Well, several things happened. There was an initial vote to ask the NLRB to certify us. We win that. Then we hold the election. To the best of my recollection, that was in the late fall of 1975. And we win that overwhelmingly. And so we're getting ready to bargain the first contract. Meanwhile, however, two things happen. One is I'm coming up for tenure. This is my tenure year. And I had been asked by a group of the probationary faculty, that is non-tenured faculty. Let me back that up. There was a meeting of the probationary faculty in which they asked several people to run for union office. Their concern, quite reasonably, was that the senior faculty, when they bargained a contract, would protect their own rights and privileges and would sell out the younger and less secure faculty. I'm pleased to say that's never, ever been the case with the union under 3 administrations, but I understand the worry about it. And so the probationary faculty held a meeting and asked several people if they would run for union positions on the policy board and the executive board, which is the 5-member executive group of the union that had just been, the bylaws had just been hammered out. And they asked me if I would run for executive board. I've never understood why. I didn't have any particular prominence on campus. I was nobody coming up for tenure. But something, maybe it was my long hair and weird pants or something, but they said, would you run for executive board? I said, I can't possibly win, but sure. So we had the election, and the leading 4 members of the executive board won by overwhelming margins. And for the 5th position, mine, I won by 3 votes over one of my colleagues who actually was a librarian. So that's how I got on the executive board. And now I'm in the leadership, and this is where my memory of what happens in the union is much sharper, because I was present. I had really been outside. I had written a letter earlier on endorsing the formation of a union, but that was the extent of my involvement before. Now I'm in it. And so now we have to hammer out our bargaining demands, not really knowing what those should look like or what they were, or how you did this, but Mr. Van Borg helped us considerably. Meanwhile, in December of 1975, a faculty and all-faculty meeting is called by the administration on what has since come to be called Black Friday in December of '75. And we are informed that the university is in terrible financial trouble. It turns out that's true. And it had a long time getting out of it because the planning had been so poor and there was virtually no endowment and virtually no sophisticated budgeting. The university was not ready to be in the 1970s, but there they were, without the money to do so. And so therefore, they were notifying all 111 of the 280 full-time faculty, all 111 probationary faculty out of the 280 total, that they were receiving layoff notices in the next week. Now, they weren't really going to fire all of us, they said, but because of the timely notice provision, they had to lay everybody off, and they'd tell us sometime later who was really getting fired and who was going to come back. As you may imagine, pandemonium set in. And I clearly remember one of my senior colleagues, a sociologist, Ralph Lane, standing up and shaking his finger at the academic vice president and saying, shame, shame, shame. And those who had been sitting on the fence about unionism, this pushed an awful lot of people into our camp because this was, of course, an outrageous action. So now we generate our bargaining proposals and we go to the bargaining table, and the president shows up and says, I don't really approve of this, but perhaps something good will come of it, and blessed us and left. And none of us had asked him to come bless us, but anyway. And we start bargaining, and our attorney says the first thing we need to know is the layoff list. That is, who are you really laying off of the 111 who've got notices? They said, well, we don't know yet. And he said, well, how many do you think you're laying off? He said, we think about 60. He said, but you don't have the list. No. Well, we're not going to bargain, but we've got a great salary improvement for you. And our attorney said, we're not going to bargain with you until we know how many people you plan to lay off. We're not going to bargain a salary increase over the bodies of our fired co-workers. So when you know how many you intend to lay off, you let us know. Or we'll call you. So a week or two later, they called us, and we came back to the table. Do you have the layoff list? No, not yet. He says, well, you called us. Well, I know, but we'd like to bargain because we got this great salary increase. How many do you think you're going to lay off? About 40. Call us when you have the names. Don't call us before then. Out. And we're, meanwhile, all quivering. Especially those non-tenured, and there were just 2 or 3 of us on the bargaining team who were on the layoff list. The original, that is, who had been given notices. So they called us back again 1, 2, 3 weeks later. Do you have the layoff list? Yes. How many are on it? 26. So already we've saved 85 jobs, plus or minus, or helped to do that. And he shoves the list across the table. And I am at that time the secretary of the bargaining committee, and I'm taking notes. And Mr. Van Borg skims the layoff list quickly and says, well, I'm glad to see none of my people are on the list. And I'm sitting next to him, pulling on his sleeve and pointing at my name on the list. What? Well, long story short, I remained on the layoff list. I was out of work for 9 months. Ultimately, my job was restored by an arbitrator with full back pay. The term of art for that is making you whole, but you're never made whole. That's an experience that you have to go through to be unemployed, to feel like maybe your whole professional career is over and the thing you've been aiming at for so many years you may or may not ever be able to practice again. And you feel unwanted, and you feel alone, and you feel angry, and it's not a, many people, of course, get unemployed in academia and elsewhere. I empathize with them. It does not feel good, but it came out okay, but it was, you can't undo the damages. Anyway.
How many were ultimately fired?
Of the 26, we were able to get restored to work for the university approximately 20. Now, not all of them were restored to their original positions. Some were given half-time work. Some were given administrative work. One guy had to work in the bookstore, for example. Not so much fun, but he had a job anyway. And only about 4 or 5 or 6 we were not able to do anything for. One of them, for example, had another full-time job as I believe as a firefighter. So it was hard to argue for him on an economic basis. But we were able to, we lost 15 academic jobs, and of those 15, about half had some other job given to them. So we, at some level, felt that we'd succeeded already, although we obviously felt terrible about the folks we weren't able to save. My job was saved because there was a provision that those who had been denied tenure would automatically have access to binding arbitration. I was denied tenure, even though all the committees recommended positively. The university said, no, we're denying tenure. And so I, along with 2 others, got access to arbitration.
Okay, now tell us how the negotiations went. What were the issues and what was fought about, and how did it turn out?
Well, the issues were everything, because we were bargaining everything. We were essentially, every university has a faculty handbook. We put the whole faculty handbook on the table and said, we want this in the contract, we want academic freedom in the contract, we want tenure provisions and tenure rights in the contract, we want professional rights and responsibilities in the contract, we want the bookstore, the library, we want everything in the bargaining agreement, because we want it protected, because we'd seen that the university was perfectly capable of disregarding what it had committed itself to in a faculty handbook or elsewhere. They said, well, it doesn't count because circumstances had changed. We wanted a document that they couldn't unilaterally decide they're going to tear it up. And that, of course, is the chief difference between having a unionized faculty and having a faculty, even a powerful faculty with all kinds of consultation rights, is there is always a clause in a faculty handbook that says this handbook may be changed at will by the board of trustees or by the university, whatever. I'm unaware of any faculty handbook that doesn't say that.
Right.
Well, a bargaining contract doesn't say that.
Right.
Has to be bargained.
And if the administration violates the CBA, then there's a whole set of
Well, there's
procedures.
grievance and arbitration, which we had to bargain for. We didn't have that before. Now, as it happens, the university hired a man, John Scalone, to bargain for them. Not a well-educated or refined man. Had worked for the canneries and so forth as a management negotiator and labor expert. And I can remember him holding up a letter that the AAUP had written protesting the treatment of faculty at USF.
Just say what AAUP is.
Sorry, the American Association of University Professors, which is the mostly non-union setter of standards for academe. For example, they provide salary and compensation data for all member universities every year, and that's been very helpful. And they, over the years, starting in the 40s, they set out the standards that they wanted to see and believed in for tenure and for promotion and for scholarly support and so on and so forth. So they've been a very valuable professional organization. In collective bargaining, they don't do so well and haven't had a big role in that, but that's another matter. So anyway, they wrote a letter to the university saying, how can you treat your faculty this way? It's unprofessional and so on. And the university's bargainer at the table, their chief negotiator, held up the letter and said, and who is this AAUP anyway? So he was not vetted in university matters, but he was a very tough bargainer, and he believed in the process. Mm-hmm. And so it wasn't too hard to get grievance and binding arbitration bargained. When the university figured out that he'd done that on their behalf, they were livid, but it was too late. The contract was in place. And that, of course, has saved us, because a contract that you cannot enforce is no good at all. It's no good if they do it most of the time, except when they feel like not.
So is this what they call the industrial model?
Well, part of it was grievance and arbitration doesn't have to be industrial model, but much of the contract was, that is, management manages and labor grieves. Right. And when faculty figured that out, they were upset. They didn't want to be labor. They wanted to be partners. And we said, we've tried that one. They don't want partners. They want subordinates. They want to run the university. If you want a voice, it's going to have to be this way. Right. Now, as it turned out, 5 years down the line, that may have saved our union, that we had a largely industrial model contract. It is not a perfect way to govern a university. It simply is not. Mm-hmm. And it's been modified dramatically over the 30 years since then. But at the time, it was management manages and labor grieves, and that ended up saving us, I think.
So the contract then was eventually agreed to. How long did it take to get signatures on that?
On the contract? I don't recall.
It went for months, I assume. It wasn't right away. I mean,
no. We're bargaining the invention of the new university. It took forever. Right. And at one point, there was a strike authorization vote taken when the university balked at some of the provisions, not money, by the way, other provisions. And we went back to the table, and eventually we reached a contract that was acceptable. We wanted a longer-term contract. The university always wanted to bargain every year, feeling at the beginning that it was going to be destabilizing for us to do it and we'd give up and go away. Mm-hmm. As a practical matter, it worked the other way. But
do you remember what so these were one-year contracts?
Early on, yeah. One of them, I think, was a 2-year contract, but it's hard. You're now asking me about things that happened nearly 40 years ago, so it's not all vivid for me.
Do you remember what the salary increase was, or around?
It was a reasonably high increase given where we were. I think it was an 8 or 10% increase, so we were brought back into shouting range of other universities in those days. Our mantra used to be, our mantra used to be, oh, dear God, let us someday catch up with the California State University salary scale. Well, I'm sorry to say that, I'm glad to say for us, and I'm sorry for California, that We have left the California state scale in the dust. We're now in line with where we ought to be with the major universities in the state. We were way behind in 1975. We caught up a little that one year, but it was a struggle every year. And part of the thing we didn't get was that there's also a salary step. Each faculty member gets a small increase every year until she or he reaches the top step of that rank, and then you're stuck there. Then you get only the cost of living increase unless you get promoted, and then you got a few more steps, and there are only 3 ranks and a few steps.
So in lieu of a one-time pay increase,
Right.
you would divide it into pieces.
Correct, correct. So there's cost of living increase and there's a step increase. We understood that we had bargained for both. It later, when we got the contract, a little bit like the BART system now, when the contract came out, except the workers had made the mistake. We didn't have the step that first year, and we were very angry at our chief negotiator, and he said, it's my fault, and I thought we had it too, but I signed off on it and so forth. So we missed the step that year, but we preserved the system, and so the steps kicked back in.
I see. So you had steps written into it, but it was somewhere there wasn't language saying you
Right.
get the step.
Right. When they said the 1970, whatever, 76, 77 increase shall be, the steps weren't mentioned. We thought they were explicit, but it turns out not. So
That's why Eric Ewan, the librarian, always says, and steps.
That's right.
Every time we bargain.
that's
Okay.
right. That's right.
So now it's 1976. What happened to the financial crisis of the university?
Well, it seemed to have an unending supply of these. It kept saying it had solved it, and then, oops, it hadn't, and the enrollment was off, or the budget was off, or whatever. And the problem was, on the one hand, the union kept being accused of jeopardizing the financial status of the university. We pointed out that they ended up in their first major financial crisis before the union had been formed, but the facts didn't bother them so much. And we said, well, share them with us. We don't want to damage the university. We're, most of us, here for the long run. We want the university to thrive and prosper. That has always been our view. We don't want to get short-term wealthy and then have the, as if that's possible, and then have the university collapse or contract or whatever. We wanted it to be healthy. But tell us the situation, give us the data. Oh, we can't do that. That would be terrible. So we said, okay, well then we'll assume you're lying then, which was generally a pretty good bet. So it stumbled along, and they brought in outside managers who had no connection with universities. Some guy who'd run a train system and somebody else who'd run a, I don't know. And so, of course, they didn't manage the university very well, and so we kept tripping and stumbling and not having enough money. Meanwhile, we bargained a contract the following year, also under duress. Wasn't easy bargaining. And then we hit 1978, so we're 3 years in, 2 or 3 years in. But what I want to stop before I get to 78 and say again, none of this is possible without Mike's leadership. It just doesn't happen. How he developed thick enough skin to stand what people said about him and did to him over and over and over again, I will never know. I know that I could not have done it. I'm very clear on that. I would have walked away, particularly when my colleagues, if my colleagues had assaulted me.
We know he has very thick skin, so I wonder what cause and effect. Did he already have it, or did it become because of it?
I don't know. It's a fair question. You should ask him. But it was kind of a constant. There were brush fires all the time. Somebody got fired. And in those days, they made terrible tenure and promotion decisions. It just, well, I like him. Okay, let's give it to him. And there was no sound process, and so we had to grieve.
And no peer review in those days, right? We'll get to that later. Or a different kind of peer review.
Correct.
Yeah.
So
it was kind of just the administration said, we'll give it to you, and there was no recourse. Is that right?
At that time. Now there was, yeah, that's right. We're outside peer review for about 10 years, from about the late 70s to 88, 89, when it comes back in a limited form.
All right, we'll come back to that. So
Yeah.
we're in the mid-70s
Yeah.
still.
So, and the other sore spot for a lot of faculty, and this is another thing neither side got at the time, the two negotiators put it together. The contract made the faculty, full-time faculty, a union shop. That is, membership in the union was not voluntary, it was required. And once again, when the management figured out they'd done that, they were really mad at their negotiator. It saved us endless organizing and endless putting out fires, and it was invaluable to us. We didn't understand it at the time, but it was.
Victor is still there advising.
Yes, yeah. I couldn't tell you the year in which Mike takes over as chief negotiator. It's several years down the road. So that union shop nettled administration and some faculty. Some years after that, in fact about 10 years after that, we bargained a partial escape clause, which is almost never used. Most faculty are perfectly comfortable by now with having to be in a union. And of course, when they're hired, every single interviewee is told this is a compulsory union membership. Do you have any problem with that? Almost everybody says no.
And this video will be compulsory now too for them to watch.
Of course, yes. And they'll have to memorize it and take a test on it. So we lurch along for 3 years, and the university is going broke. Show us the figures. No, and we bargained another contract. And then we get to 1978, and the university finally agrees, okay, well, this can be a 3-year contract. Now, we haven't quite kept pace with inflation in the first couple of years, but we almost have. No, that's not true. With the first year's increase, I guess we had. We still hadn't caught up to where we were.
When does the big inflation start? It's around there,
now,
right? Yeah.
In comes Carter.
Yeah.
In comes the OPEC boycott.
Yeah.
Mortgages are now 12, 14, 16%.
Yep.
Inflation is 8, 10, 12%. And we go to bargain the contract in 1978, and management offers us like a 4% increase in the teeth of 12 or 14% inflation. And it's the only time when we got to an impasse over money.
So impasse is not just not agreeing, it's a technical term.
Yes, and it means neither side is willing to move any further on its proposals. It doesn't have any more room for negotiation. If one side will still move, then of course it's not an impasse. If neither side will move, then it's an impasse. So we reached impasse, and the university said, we're going to give you a drop-dead date, August something, August 1st or whatever it was. And if you haven't signed off on the contract, on our proposals by then, we're going to completely eliminate the fall 1978 academic schedule. I know it's not. When I talk to new faculty, I mean, you know all this stuff, but when I've talked to new faculty, I almost always try to tell them this story because it's not typical because it's so weird, but it's an instance of what the university in those days would do or not do. And it just, unless you were there, you can't believe it because it's so stupid and so counterproductive. But there are many incidents, this being, I think, the most egregious, certainly one of them. So we're going to cancel the schedule, and every student, undergraduate student, will take, and every faculty member, full-time faculty member, will teach one course for 3 weeks, 5 days a week, for some number of hours to make up the appropriate number of hours for a 3-unit course. And you'll do that, and then we'll have the next modular unit, and each student will take, and each faculty member will teach one course for 3 weeks and so forth. And our pupils are dilating. We can't really believe what we're hearing. And finally, Van Borg said, but that's preposterous. No university in America would do this. They said, oh no, they've had very good luck with it. They're very happy with it at Cornell. Some months or weeks later, we discovered that they meant Cornell College in Iowa, but never mind. And we said, look, this doesn't make any sense. You're not punishing us. We have to show up in classroom for the same number of hours, however you cut it, but you can't teach courses in 3 weeks. Some perhaps you can, but most you can't. So you're punishing the students. Why are you doing this? It doesn't make any sense at all. If you want to get back at us, get back at us. Why are you hammering the students? It will damage the university. They said, no, because this way, if you guys go on strike, we only have to cancel 1 3-unit course, and we can hire a whole new faculty, and the students will have the rest of the semester. And it's beyond belief, and we think, okay, this is a gag. Sometime one of them's going to laugh and say, just kidding. No, they said that was what they were going to do, and they did it. And so we began the fall semester, each of us teaching 1 course for some number of hours a day, 4 or 5 days a week. And the student attrition problem, which had been a problem already up to that point, became a hemorrhage. And to jump forward some years, I don't think they ever caught up with it for possibly a decade, at least the better part of a decade. Because students said, as they were leaving, this place is crazy. This place doesn't care about us. We're going someplace where they're not clinically insane. At that point, the place was in chaos. We were all outraged. And what followed was the worst job of leadership and of organizing that the union ever did. We had already gotten 2 strike authorization votes in 2 prior contracts when they hadn't done anything horrible. Now they've actually not just threatened, but done something horrible. And the schedule is all screwed up, and students are panicking and leaving and so forth. And so we didn't go door to door saying we're going to take a strike authorization vote for the following reasons, are you with us, and so on, because it was obvious. They couldn't possibly vote no under those conditions. And we got to the fateful meeting in, I believe, October of '78, which was also the time when Harvey Milk and George Moscone had been killed, when the Jonestown massacre occurred. It was a horrible, horrible semester. And in the middle of that, our little set of problems. And we took our strike authorization vote, and we lost 2-1. And we were shocked. We couldn't believe it. But it was too late. The vote had been taken. And we went back to Van Borg and said, well, okay, now how do we accomplish what we need to accomplish? And he said, you don't. You lose. He said, you can try to take it to an arbitrator, but an arbitrator won't give to a group of employees what they will not take for themselves. So you lose. All you can do is concede. So management's final proposal had been either accept our proposal as is, or take it to an arbitrator. Refashion your final proposal in any way you want, but the arbitrator, as in baseball, they call it baseball arbitration, because this is what happens in the major leagues when a player and a team are at an impasse. The arbitrator is allowed to take only one side or the other solution in toto. The arbitrator cannot fashion a remedy, split the difference, make a compromise. It's either or. So we signed off on the arbitrator, because we couldn't bring ourselves to sign off on their proposals per se. And we said to Victor, how do we win this case? And he said, you don't win this case. An arbitrator's not going to give it to you. Okay. Sometime, and I've gotten the details wrong here, but I think it's Victor Van Borg who calls Mike Lehman in the middle of the night, a couple of weeks down the road, as we're about to have to go present our final proposals to the arbitrator to choose. And Victor said to Mike, I have an idea. I don't think it will work, but it's worth trying. Shoot. Well, we've been bargaining a 3-year contract right along. Right. No arbitrator is going to give you your 3-year proposal in preference to management's 3-year proposal because you wouldn't do what you needed to do. But if you gave an arbitrator a 1-year proposal, and those guys give him a 3-year proposal, he may be willing to punish them for 1 year rather than you for 3. Well, that's a good idea, we said. So we did it, and it worked. And when they opened the 2 proposals, the Scalone, the university's arbitrator, went out of his mind. You can't do this. We said 3 years. We said 3. And we showed him the language of the agreement, which said you can refashion your proposal in any way, whatever. But we've always been saying 3 years. Yeah. we won that. Now, we lost the second 2 years, but we still saved that we had the right increase in the first year, so we were able to mitigate the below CPI increases in the second and third year. But it took one faculty member filed a grievance claiming that he was kidnapped and held against his will in the dean's office because he had said something in class about the crazy university or the crazy administration, whatever. I mean, it's funny now, but it was horrible. I mean, it was just horrible because it showed us that those running the university really would do anything to win. They didn't care about education, about a good faculty, about the students. They just didn't care.
So in 1980, there's this major Supreme Court decision called Yeshiva. Explain that and how it affected the union first, and then we'll go into the 1980s.
The faculty at Yeshiva University in New York petitioned the NLRB for authorization to bargain collectively. The NLRB said yes. The administration of Yeshiva University said, no, we don't care what the NLRB has said. We're not going to bargain with you. You're not an appropriate unit for bargaining. You're management. NLRB disagreed, and it went all the way up the pipeline. And finally, in a Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court sided with the management of Yeshiva University. Justice Brennan wrote the minority decision. He wrote a brilliant, lucid description of the late 20th century American university. Justice Powell wrote the majority decision. He wrote a brilliant description of the medieval university. But Justice Powell had 5 votes, and Justice Brennan had 4 votes, and that was that. And Yeshiva says that where faculty have effective recommendatory power or decision-making power on, then it lists a whole group of management rights: hiring, firing, promotion, tenure, budget, so curriculum. Who else is going to do curriculum, one wonders. But where they have decision-making or effective recommendatory power, they're not an appropriate unit for collective bargaining. That killed the collective bargaining movement in higher education in the private sector dead. And there have been several units that have been, several unions, faculty unions in the private sector that have been dissolved or defeated. And there have been almost no new ones in the intervening now more than 30 years. It's simply destroyed it. You could rewrite the National Labor Relations Act to fix this, but there's only been one moment in Congress, the first half of Clinton's first term, where there were the votes to do this. And by the time that was ready to be presented, you had the Gingrich victory, and it couldn't any longer be changed. So it had a chilling effect all across universities. It had a chilling effect on us, but because we had unknowingly really bargained an industrial model contract, it really was not a danger to us because we'd given up all of those rights.
So then what were the repercussions for USF?
Well, there weren't any at the time, and there never have been. At the time, because we had bargained an industrial model contract, it really wasn't vulnerable to that kind of approach. Doesn't say the administration couldn't have tried it, but we don't think they would have succeeded at that point.
So let's talk about the 80s in the time before you took over from Mike.
Right.
What are some of the important events of those years?
Well, again, the union is solidifying. Its organizational powers are growing. Mike and the executive board really did a fine job with holding us together and holding us in place. And I had been on the executive board all of that time. I started out as the lowly secretary, and then at some point I think I was sergeant at arms. I don't know what that means. And then became vice president, so on during this time. And Mike really had done a great job in keeping us together because we were subject to relentless attacks by the administration, one way and another, and I won't go into all of them. The most egregious, after the infamous modular system, the most egregious was when, I think it was 1981, they suddenly decided they were not going to take cases to the arbitrator anymore. The contract gave us a permanent named arbitrator, whom we both had agreed on. The university said they had lost confidence in the arbitrator. We have no idea why. Nothing they said made any sense. And in fact, if you did a tally of all the arbitration cases that he'd heard, it was something like he'd ruled for the university in 18 of them and for the union in 12 or 14 of them, and had kind of split the baby in the rest. So they were winning way more than they were losing, but I guess they wanted to win them all. So they didn't want to take a case to the arbitrator. The problem was there was a contract between the university, the arbitrator, and the faculty association. And as we pointed out to them, they couldn't just rip it up. And they said, well, we're going to have to rip it up because the arbitrator is corrupt. So the arbitrator sued them for breach of contract and whatever it was, libel or slander or defamation of character. We sued them for breach of contract. The arbitrator ultimately won his lawsuit, and he was issued a public letter of apology and $150,000 is what it was. And we said, you can skip the letter of apology, we'll take the $150,000. And that became the first 2 years of the Faculty Development Fund. Before then, there was no publicly stipulated amount of money available for scholarly travel, for research support, and so forth. You had to go to the dean and beg, and the dean either gave it to you or didn't, depending on whether the dean liked you. Mm-hmm. Now we put this in the contract, saying there's an application process, denial is grievable, and so forth. And we started with $70,000 in 1980, whatever that was, 84 maybe? And now it's what, Elliot? What's the faculty?
Over $1 million.
Over $1 million. So, mighty oaks from small acorns grow. Yeah. So then there was an era of peace in 1984, once we'd settled the lawsuits. We were all going to get along then. That lasted 2 years until the 1986 contract bargaining, and that was the worst contract dispute we'd ever had, and it went on for over 20 months. We were without a contract for 20 months. And once again, the issues were not financial, that is, not financial in terms of what goes into a faculty member's pay or benefits. The two issues that remained, where we remained at impasse after everything else was agreed to. One, they wanted the union shop gone away. They wanted faculty to be able to choose to join or not. We thought it was wonderful that they had suddenly discovered the interests of faculty. And the second was they wanted the unfettered right in an economic emergency which they alone could declare to lay off tenured faculty. Okay, now this is anti-unionism 101. This is what they teach you in, in the law schools, labor law schools of the right. This is how you bust a union. Job security and union security. Right? So we said, no, that's not the longest day in hell. And we were out for 20-some months, during which time, because we felt the faculty was unlikely to strike and unwilling to strike, as we discovered in 1978, we fought a guerrilla war. I won't go into the tactics, but we did naughty things, legal, but mischievous. But we got essentially nowhere. The university didn't budge. We believed then, and I believe now, that the president, who had been president for most of that time, Father Lo Schiavo, wanted the union dead and was not willing to settle for anything less. So he was not going to get to a compromise. So there we were, 20-some months minus a contract, during which the national or the West Coast accreditation team that's responsible for giving accreditation to schools and colleges in the West, WASC, or the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, came for their regular accreditation visit, which everybody expected would end in their saying, okay, well, you should fix this stuff, go be good, and would go away. Here's your reaccreditation, bye-bye. And they came in and A, refused to reaccredit us, and in so doing wrote a report. Usually they write up to that point, they'd written a 1 or 2 page introduction, and they just go through the accreditation standards. 1, you meet it here, you don't meet it here. 2, you meet it here, you don't meet it here. Final recommendations, fix this and this and this. Here they wrote a long introduction, and they said the university had 2 overarching problems. Failure to repair both of them will ensure that you're unable to ever to gain reaccreditation. We will be back in 3, stop, I jumped ahead of myself. The 2 areas are 1, long-range planning, of which we see no evidence whatever, and 2, faculty administration relations. Now, in detailing faculty administration relations, they didn't point fingers, you did this, you did that, he did that, she did that. But anybody reading it knew who had caused 95% of the trouble. When the board of, and they said, we'll be back in 3 years, you better have your act together, see ya. And when the board of trustees got this failure to reaccredit, they finally got what we'd been trying to tell them for however long it had been, 13 years. Shortly thereafter, Father Lo Schiavo retired. A new academic vice president came in, Father Clark, who was a wonderful, enlightened, benign figure. And other changes were made, and long story, only a little bit shorter, by the time they come back in '91, they said they had never seen an institution turn around as quickly as we had turned around, and they reaccredited us for 5 years, which was more than anybody was expecting at the time. But that was the dark point, and we really felt that left to their own devices, the administration was perfectly willing to take the university over the side. And I believed then and believe now that only the faculty union prevented that.
So you have this brutal 2-year battle, and at the end of it, Mike steps down. How did that happen?
Well, it was brutal. I mean, I haven't described, I think, the flavor of life on campus between '86 and '88, and it was awful. And I didn't want to come to work a lot of days. It was so, faculty were totally demoralized. They just felt, again, that the university did not care about them and didn't care about its mission to educate. It just wanted to win. And an awful lot of things had been destroyed or badly damaged, I don't mean physically, in the process. But ultimately, the accreditation agency was the straw that broke the trustees' back. And we had this victory, at which point Mike called us together, called the executive board together, and he said, you know, I always intended to retire from the presidency after we bargained the '86 contract. I just didn't think it was going to take us 2 years to do. But now I'm really done, I'm tired, and it's time for somebody else to take over. And Alan, it's you. And I went, oh really? Wait, you know, which Alan do you have in mind? I mean, I was vice president, so there was a kind of logic to it, but I truly had not wanted it. My wife had to talk me into it, ultimately. It seemed like too big a burden and so on. And it is, as you know, a burden. Also many pleasures in it, but it's hard work and often frustrating. So we had an election. It was not unanimous. There was, again, one of the let's get rid of the union boys and get some old-fashioned faculty back in charge. A gentleman from the economics department ran against me, but I won comfortably, if not overwhelmingly. And then we had to figure out what to do next. Now, what helped us enormously was that, as I may have already said, they appointed a new provost, Father Clark. And I was sitting in my tiny little faculty office on the 5th floor of University Center one afternoon, not long after I'd been elected, and there was a very timid little knock on the door. Got to be a student who wants an extension for a paper, right? The door opens, it's Father Clark. Ellen, would you mind if I came in? I said, please. First time any major administrator had sought out the union leader to talk seriously. And Father Clark said, Alan, tell me what the university looks like from your point of view. And I said, you sure you want to know? Have you got a couple hours? Is your chair comfortable? He said, fire away. And I unloaded. I talked about all of the mismanagement that had occurred from our point of view and the foolish damage that had been caused by by this mismanagement. And I said candidly, you know, the union has some of the blame, but the administration has the overwhelming share of the blame. We want the university to thrive and prosper. We want USF to do well. I'm not sure all of the administrators on the other side have the same goal. In any case, they haven't behaved that way. And so I described the university as I saw it, and he's nodded, and he said, Alan, sounds about right to me, but you and I are going to fix it. The war is over. And I said, great, that's all we've ever wanted. And over time, because we were very, very different personalities, he was shy and retiring and thoughtful and meditative, and I'm loud and obnoxious. And I don't think Father Clark is Jewish or was Jewish, although I'm not sure. So there was a kind of a cultural divide, which was very quickly bridged, and we formed, I think, a very, very good working relationship, and piece by piece by piece. I mean, first we had to persuade people that they weren't going to put down their weapons and then get sniped. You know, so we had to reassure people and so on. And then came time to bargain the 88 contract already, or the 89, whatever it was. And at that point, WASC had issued its report and had said the faculty is no longer collegial, and it needs to be collegial. Now, WASC did not understand collective bargaining, and frankly was hostile to collective bargaining. So they didn't get it, but that's what they said. So the university came to us with some proposals about giving the faculty more, not real power, it never is, but more consultative role, including restoring peer review, which we had not had for a decade. And it was the university administration that was insisting on this, and it's we who were resisting it. And we said, partly we're resisting it on principle. I don't think peer review is a great idea. I never have. I'd be happier without it, but and I think we did fine without it. But anyway, that's another story. It makes me a heretic among my professional colleagues, but that's what I think. But also, the more consultative rights we had, the more we were backing into the yeshiva propeller. You can't have those rights, you'll be decertified. And we said, if we're going to bargain these with you, we have to have in the contract something that says you won't invoke yeshiva. So there's a so-called yeshiva bar in the contract now, early on in the contract, that says, and it's remained, I think it's remained intact from then to now, maybe there've been a tweak or two, but I think it's essentially the same. And it says even if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck and has feathers like a duck, the university will agree that the faculty is not a duck, namely a union, namely a management, and therefore is not going to interfere with your right to bargain collectively. So that allowed us to bargain some collegial and collaborative procedures and states of the faculty and so forth. And that took a long time because everybody was leery of it. So that was a lot of the first, I don't know, decade's work. And then the other challenge was that we'd held our economic position as a faculty during the previous 13 years, but only just. We had remained kind of where we were, which was kind of lower end of the spectrum. We hadn't gone backward, and that's all thanks to Mike. Yeah. But we hadn't gone forward, partly because the university was in economic distress. Now come the late 80s and 90s where economic times in America are better, and so economic times for the university are better. Enrollment is finally going up, attrition is finally going down because people are working at this. And so I was able, I'm glad to say, to help to bargain, and it takes two to tango. The university bargained these two. Support for the faculty, like a greatly increased faculty development fund that we talked about, like a child care fund, like a housing subsidy, like we doubled management's contribution to pension, and so on and so forth. So that the faculty was able to move from where it had been frozen, kind of at the lower end of things, to where we belong, which is competitive with some of the best universities in California and in the country. But that took, I mean, I was president for 17 years, from 88 to 05, and it took most of that time to get there, and there's still some things I wish we could have achieved that we didn't. But in general, those were the challenges. So on the one hand, it was making the war over, constructing a truce that everybody believed in and felt safe with. That took a long time. Enhancing faculty rights, consultation rights, and enhancing faculty economic position. And that was what had to be done. And behind that, of course, was holding the union together now that the war was over. Because there's nothing that unites a group like a common enemy. If that enemy largely disappears, there were still a few villains here and there on campus, but if the enemy largely disappears, the temptation is to go right off and pretend you're a rugged individualist and don't need the collective whole. And so it's been a struggle to try to, and you've had the same struggle, to try to keep all of the faculty on board, because it looks like everything's just fine now. And you and I both know that at any moment there can come a financial or some other kind of a crisis, and the university can just decide, oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore. And if you don't have a binding contract that's enforceable, you're helpless. But I have to say that the last two presidents have been, they've been
presidents.
USF presidents, yes. Thank you. Have been, have not been hostile to the union. Well, you can talk about your experience. I will say that the president who came in was it 90 or 91, Father Schlegel, who was there for a decade. So he was there for most of the rest of my term, and then Father Provet came in for the last 3 or 4 years. And I will say that I did not encounter from Father Schlegel ever the kind of broad gauge assault or sabotage or whatever that we'd been used to for the previous 15 years.
So before we leave the accomplishments, of which there are many of your years behind, is there anything else that you want to add to the list?
I'd mention a couple of things. One is we managed to stave off the worst of the health care burden that's imposed on most employees. We pay some, more than I would like, but much less than most employees. And we've preserved both the Kaiser and Blue Cross options. So that's, we didn't achieve that, but we kept it. We didn't achieve those benefits, but we kept them. But I think you may also be thinking about the sabbatical leave provision, which used to be 50%, paying you full salary if you took 1 semester off, but only 50% if you took 2 semesters off. That is, you'd get a semester's pay whether you took 1 semester or 2. Well, in this day and age, or anything, you know, for the last 30 years, you can't live on half salary. Now, I have to give credit here, as I should, to so many folks on the faculty who have pushed ideas at us, on us, that we hadn't thought of. And this sabbatical idea, which didn't succeed the first time around, and we just kept plugging, but the sabbatical, and that's true with most of these, by the way, you plant the seed and they say, no, impossible, nobody has that, we're not going to do it, drop dead, go away. Okay, fine. And then you come back the next year, well, we're thinking about it, and eventually you get there, often. And some...
Their thinking evolves.
Yes, as they reflect, as they discern. So some faculty member or members said you ought to have more subsidy for sabbatical leave, because younger faculty especially simply can't afford to take a year off, but it's a very valuable time. Mm-hmm. And ultimately we proposed 75% annual pay for a year's leave. And the result has been, I'd love it to be 100. I mean, that's one of the things I didn't get to. But at least it's, yeah, but at least it's 75. And so you can live on that for many people. Many more people can live on that for a year. And so we've had a lot of the scholarship among the faculty. And I sent you those figures from a few years ago, that it's articles, books, whatever, between the beginning of the union and today, quadrupled, quintupled, I forget what the numbers are. And a lot of that is due to the increased support, including the Faculty Development Fund and the 75% pay for a year's sabbatical. So I'm very pleased that that occurred. I'm proud to suggest I did it, but in fact, we did it. And the union did it.
Yeah.
And that one didn't come from us. The child care provision did not come from us originally, though I fought the good fight for it. We didn't get the child care center on campus built, but we got more money for child care.
And the promise is still in the contract.
I know, they say they're going to do it, but you and I won't live that long.
So looking back now, when you think of the way things were when the union was founded, and you look at the way things now, what strikes you about what has changed? And to finish off, what are for you the headwinds and what are for you the tailwinds facing USF?
Well, that's a big question, because the university has changed 2 or 3 different times since I've been here. Starts out as a kind of a backwater, then it becomes kind of a polyglot mix in the 60s. Then it hits financial crises and things get cut back. And for example, there were 10 years of deferred maintenance on campus, and the place looked like a slum during the 80s. It was just embarrassing. Oh, save money, save money, save money. And we kept saying, don't you understand that if you save $1 now, you're going to lose $3 in tuition down the road? No. And then we were able to gradually build up the faculty, and of course every enhancement of the faculty positions here, research support, teaching support, everything, means that we can hire better and better and better faculty. I would never be hired here today. I don't have nearly the credentials. I didn't have anything like the credentials that now entering faculty have. So that's important. I hope and believe that we are still at least equally a teaching university. I hope and believe that we don't delude ourselves that we're going to become, Michigan State or
Reed or something. Well, Reed is a teaching university.
No, a big research where the serious faculty drop in to teach an occasional course. We don't. That's not who we are. That's not who we want to be. Right. And I hope that's not who we become. And I don't think so. And as I say, the period between 75 and 88, which was all of the turmoil around the foundation of the union and the university's academic and economic situation, I would not want to live through that again. That was not fun. I didn't like it. It was demoralizing. When the day broke, and it broke gradually between Father Clark and the union and others, it's become a very, very different place. I think, maybe the disgruntled folks don't talk to me, but I think that people generally like working here, want to stay here, believe in the place, believe in its particular culture and its particular tradition. So that's the good news. The challenges ahead are many, and I'm not an administrator, so I don't have a handle on all of them, but at least from the faculty and union point of view. First, it's what I've mentioned a few moments ago. You have to keep the faculty together. It was thrilling when we had a common enemy, because the faculty linked arms and walked forward together. Now, what was happening was not thrilling, but the sense of cohesion and mutual support. What happened? An enemy to one is an injury to one is an injury to all. That feeling was really there. I'm not sure it's quite as powerfully here, and I hope it can. I hope you've done a good job in maintaining it in the face of prosperity, which to some extent is an enemy. Of course it's a good. We want it, but it makes organizing against the opposition harder. So the challenge is that we've succeeded. It's not that there's nothing left to do. There's plenty left to do. We can always be a lot better in any number of ways, and we will be. But in keeping that cohesion, that's tougher. And so I think often the individual can get cut off at the pass, can get excluded or marginalized, and that we hope that the union helped prevent, and we hope that it will continue to prevent it, that we want to go forward collectively and not as individuals, not only as individuals. The other hazard is the economic and academic conditions prevailing in the United States. And I think USF is in better shape than many such universities, than many mid-sized private universities. I think endowment really needs to be built up. We're short on endowment, and we need to be much better about that. And that goes all the way back to the mismanagement of the 1960s, and 3 presidents so far, 4, have scrambled to catch up, and we're not caught up yet. We're not where we need to be on endowment. That's nobody's fault, at least nobody who's still alive, but that needs to be fixed. But education costs. It's labor intensive. Nobody's figured out a good way to keep the quality of education and reduce the costs. Every way people
MOOCs,
can,
I would say. But that's another story.
everything that people think of to help reduce costs, whether it's more online or bigger classes or more part-timers and fewer full-timers, they all clearly and inarguably
Have costs.
reduce the quality of education. Nobody has, so it's not that anybody's being bad and not doing the thing we all know should be done. Nobody quite knows what to do. And meanwhile, as everybody knows, the costs of higher education, especially private higher education, have vastly, grossly outstripped the rise in means of the families that send their kids here. People across the political spectrum are understanding that we have to train our students to do the jobs that exist. The problem with that is that it tends to be short-sighted, and people are all about vocational and pre-professional training. And the value of a liberal arts education is thereby diminished. And that's a disaster. And that that's the darkest cloud that I see on the horizon. If you graduate an English major, and that English major walks out onto the street looking for a job, you can be pretty sure, even if he or she is a terrific young person, or not young person, you can be pretty sure that that person will have a harder time finding a job, will have fewer choices of jobs, and will make less money than somebody who's been trained in computer science or in business or whatever. Now, we all know that. And people look at that and say, well, then skip this liberal arts junk, it doesn't help anybody. What we also know is that from 5 to 8 years down the road, depending on what you're measuring, whether you're measuring promotability, self-esteem, job satisfaction, even salary, peer esteem, measure whatever you want, somewhere between, let's say, 5 and 10 years, the liberal arts major will catch and pass the vocationally trained undergraduate. I'm not talking about graduate degrees now, but the undergraduate, because if you train somebody to do a job and the conditions of that job change, and they always do, and at blinding speed now, that person is screwed. Doesn't know what to do, isn't trained for anything. If you train somebody, help train somebody to think, to read, to write, to respond creatively to a number of situations, that person can make the best of a changing work situation. Ultimately, then, a liberal arts education is vital. But I wonder whether by the time people figure that out, there won't be anybody in power that's ever had a liberal arts education, and so they won't know how to fix it. They won't know what's wrong. So that, I think, and here I think the Jesuit tradition really helps us, because the Jesuit tradition is profoundly a liberal arts tradition. And I believe we should embrace that fervently, not cynically, but because it's right, because you want to educate the whole person to live a complete life, not just somebody who can walk out and get 4 jobs rather than only 1.
Well, and I really want to thank you for sharing those stories with us today. They're fascinating stories. They're also important stories for people at USF who I think should know about the history of the association and how it got founded and its evolution.
It really has been a privilege to represent the faculty. Sometimes it was a pain, but it was also always a privilege. And I wanted to say before, and I don't want to stop without saying, anybody in a leadership position has some doubts about whether the next person is going to do it okay. And I'm sure Mike had serious doubts about me, which were well-founded. And I doubted, too, that having done it for, 17 years, the next person could do it. And what I want to say is you've done spectacularly well We had 3 different sets of contexts and environments and problems, and you've handled your set of them with great mastery and good grace, and I think you've provided extraordinary benefits to the faculty. I hope they appreciate it. I certainly do, and it's been a pleasure working with you.
I feel exactly the same way. Thank you, Ellen. I really appreciate that.